You're listening to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast, episode 2, hosted by me, Robert Plotkin. Today I'm going to be speaking with Maggie Jackson, author of Distracted, The Erosion of Attention in the Coming Dark Age, first published in 2009. Maggie Jackson is an award-winning author and former Boston Globe columnist known for her penetrating coverage of social issues, especially technology's impact on humanity. Her essays and articles have appeared in publications worldwide, including the New York Times, Business Week, Utne, and on National Public Radio. Fast Company likened Maggie Jackson's book, Distracted, to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring as the first wake-up call to our technological excesses. Distracted was also hailed by The New Yorker as the influential book on distraction. We're extremely pleased to welcome Maggie Jackson to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast. Good morning, Maggie. It's great to have you on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast today.
Well, it's a wonderful topic and title, and I'm delighted to be with you here.
Thanks so much. And it's really fitting to have you as our first guest on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast, given that you were the first person to write deeply about the topic of attention and distraction in connection with digital technology. Your book, Distracted, was really prescient when it was published back in 2009, which is ages ago in internet time. I remember that at that time, everyone was jumping on the multitasking bandwagon, was cheerleading all of the benefits of being connected all the time and everywhere. And you were really the first person to wave a big red flag about the downside, and you called it even the dark side of being constantly connected. And since that time, many other people have written about this, and there have been many findings in psychology and neuroscience that have confirmed what you observed and what you predicted would happen. More people are now acknowledging the problems with multitasking and social media. And in light of that background and history, I wonder whether you could talk a bit about what motivated you to write about this way back when, or what it was like to be writing and speaking about this as a lone voice at the time, and perhaps what's changed in the broader culture, maybe in your own thinking, and how things have evolved since then.
Sure. Yes. No, I think those are important questions, because as we try inch by inch and, send by send button to gain perspective on our technologies, we have to look back and look forward and take a step back and ask ourselves these questions. And that's exactly why I wanted to start in on understanding technology's impact on human life and day-to-day life. I had come from a background where I was a foreign correspondent for many years in Europe and in Asia. I then started one of the first, if not the first, columns in the United States devoted to work-life balance. So I was really one of the first to write about that. And then I wanted to be writing about technology's impact way back in the late 90s on family life, on our workplaces. But at the time, actually, the conversation was really dominated by, you might say geeks, by people who wrote about the objects, the hardware, the software, by people who were really closely related to the inventors. And that's something that's historically true going back into the 19th century, as the historian Carolyn Marvin has wonderfully outlined in her book, in one of her books. And, so the inventors dominate the conversations often in history. You'll find that with the telephone, et cetera. And that's about where I gained interest. And I wanted to say, or to write about, or to think about why we weren't understanding anything beyond the so-called magic. There was a lot of discussion about, gee whiz, what can it do? And not what it will do to us or how it's influencing us. And I thought that I was really very determined or motivated by the idea that English majors or parents or the average person should have a voice at the table of this new age, this new transitional age. And that basically we shouldn't be listening only to what inventors or programmers thought about the usage of these instruments and these tools in our lives. We had the boxes in many often, but didn't really often know what to do. I mean, one prime example is I was trying to write about a second wave of the digital divide. This is in the about 2005, 2006 was when I was on a fellowship. Again, the boxes or the computers had been distributed to low-income neighborhoods, and yet they weren't being used, they weren't being fixed, and in particular, technological savvy wasn't being, distributed as well or taught. And so the promise was being broken, and no one wanted to print that story. So we had very narrow perceptions of what technology was, and that's one reason I wanted to write about this. And what I've seen today, which is really, what I've seen over the years, which is really interesting, is that, again, as so often happens with the adoption of technologies, there's a gee whiz, there's a kind of a black and white thinking, the Luddite versus the early adopter, and then there's a maturation of the conversation. Anyhow, I think that we might be tiptoeing toward some, if not maturation, at least a complexity in the tenor of the conversation that we're having. And one marker of that is that people are uneasy. As you mentioned so rightly, multitasking was at first considered a job description. It was the new thing. It was the new normal. And then people began to feel, partly backed by the early research, that this couldn't be done. Now, of course, we'll talk about that in the conversation today, but the research absolutely shows that it very, very often can't be done. But these sorts of new complexities and contradictions and nuances of the conversation are really important. 70% of people now say the net has boosted the quality of their life, but an equal number say that they believe the net and technology today has made us lazy and distracted. So you can see the tension right there. And I think it's really important that we now have more voices at the table, that we're getting beyond the Luddite versus adopter status, and that we're opening our eyes to layers and degrees of complexity. For instance, degree of use, habits infiltrating our lives, and how we use these objects as they become more familiar and more invisible to us, which is actually a danger point. How our thinking changes when we're on the very template-oriented internet. We are really inserting ourselves into the thinking of the creation of someone else with far less creativity and individual ability, originality in that interaction than we conceive. And then the devices themselves, how as they're changing, we have to keep up with how they're impacting us. And finally, we need to be zooming out and understanding the context. For instance, in the debate about children and media, it was very often, what's the content on the TV? Well, now there's a whole field of research related to background TV running in the 4 hours a day. Most children on average are exposed to 4 hours of background TV just running in the background, and that lowers parental conversation, learning of words, et cetera, et cetera. So the layering, the use, the context, the environment that we're creating, all this has to be added. It's a steep learning curve, but I am heartened that we're getting beyond the gee whiz, what can it do perspective.
Yeah, I hear you raising many important topics. One of them is the tendency that many of us often have, promoted by the technology industry, to focus our attention on the technical features of the devices. And it sounds like you're pushing us to focus on the impact that devices have on people or on how we interact with them, not just on the devices themselves. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that one of the one of the main points or intentions of the technology industry, and this isn't wrong, it's quite natural, and I'll say why in a minute, is the idea of seamlessness. So that's an incredibly important aspect of our technological use today that is, I think, very little talked about. Now, you can look at the Apple ads and et cetera. This is it. This is the experience. The technology, I mean, people are explicit. The technology should be invisible. It should be just part of the fabric, literally now in your clothing, of our lives, et cetera, et cetera. But this seamlessness, now on the good side, we're talking, of course, about augmented cognition and homo faber, the human as the tool user, the hammer and the carpenter, the haptic bond between pilots and their planes and people and their horses. This is all part of the, progress or the strengths of humanity. Absolutely. But, we're not just talking about a hammer. We're talking about a super normal, pulsing, cognitive-oriented prosthetic mind that we're becoming increasingly blended with. And I think that is very difficult to gain perspective on. So we, I think, need to do a far better job at stepping back and understanding the boundaries between the devices, even those we most want to imbibe or become, have a very intensely symbiotic relationship with. We need to gain perspective. The tools are not going to give perspective to us on the tools. We're the only creatures that can have perspective. I might be proven wrong in terms of a dolphin. Having said that, really, we're maybe among the only creatures on this earth that can have perspective on ourselves and on these devices. We can't give up that battle to have perspective.
It's interesting. It sounds to me like you're talking about the fact that being distracted by technology can often impede people from even stepping back and thinking about the technology more broadly, and that we need to be able to pay some deep attention to the broader impacts of the technology so that we can participate in how it's developed and how we use it. There was something you mentioned earlier about the fact that people who use technology often aren't really involved in having a voice, I think is the term you used, in how it's developed or promoted. And you're pointing out it can be difficult for people to even formulate their voice if they're not thinking critically or if they're distracted all the time. I mean, am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, I think this has everything to do with distraction. The challenge of gaining perspective has everything to do, or the fact that we are uneasy and yet not really truly doing a better job at both understanding and using these tools, has everything to do with the way we live highly distracted lives. Just talk about for a moment, the historic, I think the distraction we're seeing has a great deal to do with the historic changes to the human experience of space. So that from cues of sun and season to the controlling of time that we experience in the industrial age, you could, preserve the voice through the phonograph or run a moment backwards in the cinema. This, elevation of our experience of time to a controlling idea has then morphed into this kind of unfettered idea of layering time. So, we seem to be masters of time and what we do, as well as, the proponents of collapsing distance and not suffering duration. So I'm just throwing out a lot of different ways, I think, lenses to see what the devices have done. And this has a great deal to do, this blurring, this boundaryless, this instantaneity has affected, as we all feel, how we think and how we can pay attention. And, one of the most robust, if not, I think the biggest impact of these changes has been through the fracturing of the moment of our attentional. And it's really interesting to think about that. Well, multitasking is still it's kind of old news, but yet I think that when you look at multitasking writ large as the fragmentation of time, the fragmentation of task, the fragmentation of relationships, I mean, this is a very central reason why we can't be doing that great thinking. And maybe you have a question about this multitasking. I think it's really important.
Yeah, let's talk about multitasking. I've seen as well that there is more acceptance now that multitasking is not always the best thing to do. And yet it seems that a lot of people still have the intuitive feeling that if they're doing multiple things at once, they must be more productive. And even if they don't have that thought or feeling, many people, myself included, still do it. Our behavior is still to multitask, even if we know intellectually that it's not necessarily the right thing to do. But so we might have reached a point of ambivalence now. I wonder if you could, at least for those people who aren't familiar with really the downsides of multitasking, talk a bit about why we at least need to think really carefully about whether to do it and what the harms of it can be.
Sure. Yes, I think that originally we didn't really have the research to back up our understanding of what multitasking is. I mean, even though there have been psychological studies going back actually to 1902 related to, what's called dual tasking or task switching, et cetera. The knowledge actually was kind of there. It didn't, bleed into the public really until people, and I was looking back at databases to see, I couldn't find a reference to the multitasking that we think of now until about 2008. Previously, it really was a computer term. And, right from then and there were tiny little people, tiny voices or some pushback a little bit, as you mentioned, quite a bit by me. But so it's a kind of a new thing, and the research has followed. Basically, people switch tasks every 3 minutes at work, and half of the interruptions that are, this task switching involves are self-made. So
I just want to stop there for a second, because it's such a shocking statistic to say that you're saying office workers or maybe even other workers, when they're engaged in a task, will actually switch from what they're doing every 3-4 minutes.
Yes. I mean, they could be working on one project and still switching between it. But yes, that is the best research so far by Gloria Mark at UC Irvine. And what was new about it was she went into the field. This is not laboratory research, and she's done study after study that shows that level of interruption and fragmentation is related to stress and frustration. She's taken, had people voluntarily stop email just for a week and found that their productivity and their ability to stay on target, in other words, to have a kind of a journey or a progression or a thread of meaning throughout a project or a task is much more elevated as well. They actually communicated just as often and just as well with their coworkers. I mean, no one's trying to say take away email, but nevertheless, it just shows the degree of fragmentation. And there's studies that show that when people this is so normal now that, when you're on your laptop and you're watching TV, people switch attention up to 120 times an hour. And 70% of emails on average are open in 6 seconds. I mean, the list can go on. And of course, we recognize this. We recognize this picture of fragmentation. And there are 2 points. One is that these studies that show the degradation of attention related to multitasking have been followed by now a revealing picture of what happens when we multitask all the time. So I think that's the most interesting. We're beginning to see hints of what the long-term effects are when this is the steady diet of our lives. For instance, the late Clifford Nass, the amazing pioneering scientist, at Stanford, did work on heavy versus light multitaskers and how they dealt with their environment. He really broke ground. And one of the takeaways there is that the heavy multitaskers actually couldn't multitask as well. He called them suckers for irrelevancy. It's now thought that their broad attentional scope was actually working against them, so that therefore so much was coming at them, or they were trying to take in so much by hopping around, that they actually couldn't focus or discern what was important in their environment, which is huge. And a second body of work, which is really interesting, is related to multitasking and memory. And this is really important in a world where instantaneity often means ephemerality, both in terms of the content, that we're dealing with, but also, our minds. And this this research shows that when people are multitasking while trying to learn, just take in new information, that they're actually using parts of their brain related to automatic behavior. And what that means is the hippocampus, the seat of long-term memory and also discernment of new experiences, that hippocampal system is not being used. So the brain is trying desperately to keep up with this deluge and not able to. Now, the clincher is that the memory...
Let me just make sure I understand what you're saying, that when we're all bouncing from an email to an article on the web to Facebook and bouncing back and forth and flitting all over, we're not able to form long-term memories of the information we're absorbing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, less so. The information that we're absorbing is more ephemeral. It'll disappear more quickly, in plain language. And what's really a clincher is that the information that we do imbibe, that what we are learning, say you're at a conference, you're listening to a speaker, you're multitasking your way, checking your email the entire time. Yeah, you might pick up on what that speaker has said, but in a very shallow way. And that information will be stored in places where it's less connected to the rest of your knowledge structures. So the information that you pick up when you're multitasking is less flexible. There's less transfer of knowledge. It's think of it in the analogy of a child multitasking their way through their math problems, those word problems that at least I always really didn't get as a kid. And so they can do the word problem if it shows up the next day on the quiz, but they will not be able to flexibly transfer the rules or the ideas behind the word problems to a word problem that's slightly different. So you're stuck with very rigid knowledge that is basically not able to be drawn upon in a creative way. Or, hey, say the surgeon multitask their way through a certain lecture in med school on suturing, or bleeding in the operating room. Then they come to the crisis moment. Well, they might be able to understand, what the textbook thing to do is, but not have that creative problem solving in a crisis that allows them to connect different, new knowledge, think on their feet, etc. This is huge. This is really huge. It means that we're stuck on the surface in a steady way throughout the day, and that going forward, we're not able to, really use our knowledge creatively, which is when we're facing the problems of the day, that's a real albatross.
I wonder if this also means whether people are more likely to absorb this kind of information less critically, take it at face value when they are multitasking and absorbing it in the way you're talking about. Is that true as well?
Yes, bingo. Yes, that's a fantastic question. That's very, very important. This what your question does is connect to a different kind of idea of cognition. Something perhaps we've all heard of. We have quick and slow minds. The quick mind is, a pattern maker, survival oriented. We jump to a conclusion based on what our experience shows. I think that's, the right chess move. I think that's what I did in the past. The slow mind is the reflective mind. And, time after time, the slow mind is the reflective mind. And that's the mind that we evolve to use in crisis or murky or muddy or new situations, the kind of situations we face all the time, every single day, in which we kind of need to break from the routine. Well, when you're multitasking, when you're distracted all the time, you're using more of that quick mind. You're really miring yourself. You're sticking close to the coastline of your old knowledge. You're not allowing yourself the time. You're not allowing yourself the cognitive ability to capacity to basically launch into this place of reflective thinking. Just one example is when you're consciously aware of something, when you're really focusing on it. Now it's known that basically that's an extraordinary moment in the brain. And it's one of the most astonishing findings of recent years that the brain is highly connected, all parts of the brain, when we're really focusing on something, and it creates what is called the global workspace. That's the space when you can begin to reason and understand and see nuance and pick up on contradiction and turn the problem around in your mind. If you are simply just buzzing by things and half aware and rushing and multitasking and using less of your brain, you're actually really only able to confirm. Often you end up confirming what you already know, confirmation bias, but you're just not able to pick up on nuance and contradiction. Think of it as like the mind as a train, and as you look out of the train at 70 miles an hour, the landscape is a blur. If you're going 10 miles an hour or walking or stopping at a station, suddenly the landscape. So this is a perceptual challenge, and it's a reflective challenge. And by constantly, I could go on. There are many more, many more downsides to this kind of multitasking and distraction. And it does fit back with what we've been talking about, which is the fracturing of life, the fragmentation. What I call the integrity of the moment is broken when you're multitasking all the time.
I wonder if we can talk about some concrete examples. Everything you're talking about makes me think of some recent current events, specifically all of the controversy over so-called fake news. And I imagine when people are reading on Facebook and seeing ads or headlines out of the corner of their eye, maybe not paying close attention to them, but getting exposed to this information frequently, I have to wonder whether people are more likely to absorb that information uncritically as true, even if it's patently false.
I think that's very likely, highly likely. And the other interesting aspect of how the mind meets, and I'll just underscore again, think of your relationship with the machine and the content that you're looking at. When we're on a so-called online or digital page, there's a very hyper-fractured nature of that experience. Hyperlinked websites, the more cluttered they are related to lower comprehension and recall. So yes, that experience, we studies show that 80% of people skim their way through whatever they read digitally. They're not only catching 20% of words on the page. So you have this, narrow experience, which is hyperfractured. Zoom out, and of course, you're also looking at the TV or juggling multiple different medias, couple phones, another laptop maybe. There's a fractured environment, which is also, again, we've talked about those downsides. So yes. And one thing that's really, really interesting is the brain doubt is actually something that comes second. There's work by Daniel Gilbert, the great happiness researcher up at Harvard. Some of his early work, which I think is really fascinating, shows that the mind believes before it doubts. That this has been actually a kind of a question throughout philosophy for a long time. But in any case, that's why children are gullible. That's why, if I tell you that a shark has 4 legs in the Amazon somewhere, there's a shark species of that kind, at first you're going to picture it and you're going to be thinking about it as if it's true. And then, only then, can you begin to think and doubt. So, the fact that we flit from fact to fact, and in this fractured environment means that we are far more gullible. And in fact, studies of time pressure or flux, et cetera, show that that's what happens to people. They, leap to a conclusion. They are far less critical, and they then, protect what their conclusions are, rather than understanding. And it's really interesting because I've done a little reading about Darwin's habits of mind, and he had what he calls the golden rule, which I think is really wonderful. Of course, he did a tremendous amount of research. He had an international, habit of corresponding with people all over the world, which was, really pretty much a networked society of his own. I mean, they weren't in the dark ages, as we sometimes think. And in any case, he had a golden rule in which whenever he came across any fact which contradicted his current hypothesis, he made sure to write it down, because he knew that he'd be more likely to not remember, to basically try to forget unconsciously, what differed from his opinion. So all of what we're talking about has a tremendous, I see it huge, it's not even a dotted line. It's like just a clear line between the way we're living and the society that we've produced in terms of intolerance, in terms of shallow level of discussions, polarization. I don't think technology and these habits have kind of fallen off the radar screen in the last few months because of the crisis nature of what's gone on in our country and the world. And yet these discussions related to distraction, technology, devices, et cetera, should be still very central in our thinking, because that's why I think we are so mired in the shallowness that we see everywhere.
You just started to touch a little bit with the Darwin example on things that people could possibly do for themselves to help regain some attention and protect against distraction. Sometimes when I think about the problem or just experience it every day, it can feel overwhelming. What can we do against all of this technology that's designed to capture our attention from us? You mentioned earlier the quote average person. What can the average person who's not designing technology and may not be a super user who knows how to tweak it or change it, but really whose only choice is to use the technology or not? Do you have some suggestions for things that, let's start with what individual people could do to help regain some attention, be more thoughtful, be able to cultivate critical thinking and creativity while having to live with and use technology?
Sure. No, I think that the problems seem large, but what's heartening is that there is so much that we can do that are very small steps. And that was true when I was writing about work-life balance. Small steps, small portions of flexibility make a big difference in family life. And I think that's really heartening. I'll also say that the unease people are feeling is really a marker of that's the first threshold moment toward reflecting. I think as a society, if we are uneasy, that shows we are trying to gain perspective, and that's really important. One very small thing we can do is, take small breaks. Now, I mean, not just turn it off or turn it away, but also, to pause and reflect. So there are two different types of breaks I'm talking about. One is that kind of emptying or changing gears in an intentional way, not in a multitasking, hopscotching way. But you can pausing for a minute before you start a new project is actually related to boosted creativity, according to Harvard work by Teresa Amabile, one of the greatest creativity researchers in the world. And in studies of students, 1 minute tech break, so taking, again, stepping back from the computer or the smartphone for 1 minute every 15 minutes while doing a project has shown to bolster attention and learning. So, it is so the allure and the seamlessness are very, very hard to break. But if we can take, and don't think of this as in another interruption or a fracturing of your focus, or you're getting a lot done on screen, because basically you're changing gears in order to either give the topic a rest, which means your unconscious is still thinking about it, or you're giving the topic a rest in order to take a walk, etc., while still thinking about it. That's absolutely fine. You're thinking about it in an unencumbered way, or maybe hopefully in a more a moment with more integrity. So I think these are very small steps. We don't have to do the 2-week detox camp grounded in California and that sort of monastical, which is great. And people love that. But I don't think we have to think about it as some sort of eco-adventure extreme sport, turning off the technology for a moment. This can be woven into our lives. The second thing I think, which is very, very, very important, especially when we are inhabiting the internet, when we are, again, very linked to the machine, is just to constantly think, evaluate. The first answer, the surfaces from the quick mind, the first impressions that we have are plausible and neat and mostly off track. That's when we have a mind, a skeptical side to us. Well, we need to use it. I mean, if I come across information, even of a scientific study that I might find on Google Scholar, it might be even from a great university, I do far, far more, double to triple about the amount of time spent evaluating a piece of research than I do in finding more research. So that kind of selectivity, I think people have this fear of missing out. They have this idea that they're not keeping up. They're trying to run in place. They're trying to drink from the fire hose. That's still a huge problem. Multitasking is fueled by it. But at the same time, with less data, you can actually make more conclusions if you allow yourself and if you practice that kind of evaluative skill. And that couldn't be more important.
You wrote in Distracted about this increasing tendency, particularly amongst the next generation, to do writing primarily by gathering information and dumping it essentially unfiltered into a PowerPoint presentation or something else, often copying from Wikipedia or another place. It really struck me. You gave an example where you said students were interviewed, and if there was some sort of nonsense information somewhere in the presentation that they had clearly just cut and pasted without thinking about it, and they were asked, why is that there? They would say, I don't know, even though they had written this presentation or report. I'm sure this applies to adults as well, but is this the kind of thing you're thinking about needing to address, this sort of unfiltered, automatic habit now that many of us have of seeking out, searching for, copying information and doing it in an uncritical way? And then the follow-up question to that is, What can you suggest, particularly with respect to the next generation who doesn't have a previous background or experience in ever doing anything in a different way than this?
Right. No, that's great. That's great questions. I mean, we're really talking about information literacy, and if we are able to garner a moment's focus, well, then what is the product of that? What is the impact, and how can we then link that to a better skill set at thinking? How can we rekindle basically our powers of reflection? They're so sorely needed, and I think that it's a really important challenge. I mean, one recent study I saw showed that of the 250 students who I believe were in middle school, might have been in high school, they could only answer, and they were asked to evaluate information found on the web about an energy drink, a very simple research task. Only 20% could answer questions correctly related to the bias of the source, where it came from, what the information was really saying. So their evaluation studies have shown that younger generations' ability to evaluate is extremely low. I think that we need to start in many ways with having conversations like these, in which we step back and make more explicit some of the meta ideas behind this. That goes along with being skeptical, of course, but understanding what it is that we're looking at, how it is when you're on Match.com that by filling in this profile, you're shifting your identity toward the values of Match.com and not yourself. It might not prevent you from, walking on that website, but having an understanding about that is really important. It drives back to what we were talking about seamlessness. So I think with children especially, there needs to be far more time making explicit what our habits are, what our intentions, what our values are. And even if we don't have all the answers, in some ways it might be common sense. The TV in the crib. Well, is it really going to help baby Mozart with vocabulary, or is it siphoning time away from the conversations and the human interaction that child needs? I mean, that can be often common sense. One study, which was really interesting to me, found that a better use of the internet by children, less porn, less kind of violent sites, use of violent sites, et cetera, just better habits, was related to not the kind of rules that parents had at home, but whether or not they had any. And whether or not there had been some discussion for children related to the idea of, well, we do have a stand on this. You're not out there in the great boundaryless, chaotic seas alone. We have a practice related to this. I think that's very, very, very important. That gives us a kind of, so if we step back as adults, say, I have a certain value related to when I use the internet at night, or how I use the internet to, how I use my phone at the table. What are our values related to that? There's a certain morality here, I think.
Yeah, I remember the author of Sleeping with Your Smartphone. She was a business consultant.
Yeah.
Leslie Perlow, talking about even groups of people doing it. I've certainly found that when I individually try to impose rules about using technology, it can be hard when other people aren't doing the same thing. If I say I'm not going to answer email from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, that may be really difficult when my colleagues or customers or friends or family all expect it of me. And she had suggested in the business context that people as a group, for example, agree that they won't contact each other at certain times in part to relieve that social pressure. That if we agree we're not going to text each other from 6 to 10 on Wednesdays, then people in that group won't feel pressured to check a text because they know everyone else has made the same commitment. And I'm raising this to move up from the individual level, where you're making some great suggestions about what people do, to the family, company, organization, and perhaps even broader society level. I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I think those are really important points. I mean, one very important finding from Leslie Perlow's work was that, first of all, the work she did at the Boston Consulting Group started off very small. So she, had to work hard, but convinced the consultants who, these management consultants who work like maniacs and never felt like they could take any time off. She ultimately convinced them to take one night off each a week, and
Yes.
to change it up so that you were covering for each other. That in itself changed how they work and gave them so much more energy. So that's really important. I think that beyond the veneer of the always on, the necessity of always on, lies a real yearning to somehow break up that system or to turn down the volume on that system. I think, you might just find this with teenagers who want the rules related to texting at the table, or you find that in your team when everybody gets beyond the, kind of empty talk of we're always so busy and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that by having the courage to voice these ideas and to start small, then people can be making, and finally, any change in life, and this is just extremely important, I see it as a matter of tinkering. We don't have to bite off everything, make the big fix, change our lives, et cetera, reinvent ourselves tomorrow. Tinkering means experimenting. That means getting feedback from that meeting without multitasking, without everybody put their phone by the door, as happened in the Obama White House meeting. Mm-hmm. When we do that, when we experiment and then talk about it and then adjust and then tinker and go forward that way, well, then there's a lot less of a win or lose at stake, and we can then begin to it's kind of doing it in a kind of organic way. And so changes to our life can be made like that.
Yeah, make small changes, observe the results, talk about it and revisit. And as you said, not try to do so much at once that you maybe set yourself up for failure.
Right, exactly. And, one interesting, sort of line of research I've been interested in group creativity for the new book I'm doing on the reflective mind. And it's really interesting. I mean, everyone's known about groupthink and everyone knows about the perils of that. But it's really interesting to see what dissent does for a group or a team. Someone who just simply, isn't openly rebelling and refusing all technology, et cetera, but just voices a different opinion, that actually leads to more information search on the part of all members. In other words, it leads to more reflection. So, we can see that throughout society. The Gandhis, the Eleanor Roosevelts of the world have always been the ones who have turned people's heads a little and given them a new perspective. And isn't this a matter of maybe taking responsibility, not just letting life wash over us as it is? I hear this phrase less and less, but for a long time I heard the phrase is related to technology, well, there's nothing we can do. This is the way it is. And I have to heartily, vehemently disagree. That's like saying my vote doesn't count in an election. And
right. We
all can take these small steps and do it together and make it explicit. And bosses, people who are in charge, managers, et cetera, have a particularly important responsibility if they don't want their teams and workers to burn out or miss the nuance or, et cetera, or become victims of multitasking minds. if they want all that, they really have a responsibility in particular to make these discussions and stop fearing the great, productivity god, or redefine what productivity is. I spent time with a surgeon up in Toronto who's really kind of shaking up the surgical world, and she is actually calling for a new idea of what expertise in surgery is, and that is to import uncertainty or thoughtfulness. Now, this flies, as you might know, completely in the face of the identity of any surgeon on earth. They're schooled for quick decision making, which often fails in a crisis. The point here is that, hey, we can see productivity in a very different light if we wish to, and if we wish to just make the first couple of steps.
We're turning now to the newer work that you're doing, which is leading to a book I believe will be published later this year called Beyond Certainty. It picks up, I think, where your last book left off. I have to say, in Distracted, which had the phrase coming of a dark age in the subtitle, a good part of it could lead someone to be fairly pessimistic about where we were heading. But you did leave off on a positive or potentially hopeful note at the end of Distracted. And you even said that you believed and you called it a renaissance of attention was within our grasp. So I wonder if you can, talk a little bit about what it is that you see that's hopeful in light of all of the challenges we face with attention and distraction in the face of technology, and then how that relates to the newer work that you're doing now.
Sure. I remain, I guess, given the society and the problems we face today, I remain highly concerned and alarmed, and I think many others would share that view, if not even more so. I think actually a dark age is not alarmist in the slightest when we look at the world around us. However, that does not mean that there aren't places for hope. And this unease, this maturation of the discussion regarding technology is, I think, really important. Again, trying to detox from phones, digital detoxes, Facebook sabbaticals, or, these sorts of riffling type of experimentations are very important. And the reason I began to write a book on reflection was really the question, when you have a moment's focus, if we can regain our skills of attention, which are related to actually focus, awareness, and then executive attention, if you can regain or practice these skills, be more aware of what science tells us about their workings, then what do you do with them? So the obvious answer was to turn to a different skill set, which is thinking. And I think, yes, we talk about critical thinking in schools, and we try to, brush up against these sort of issues. But I'm really interested in the kind of experiential, phenomenological, if you will, idea of what it means to think and reflect, again, in ways that are woven back into our day. So, what does it mean to creatively problem solve when you're a scientist in a lab or a business executive? And what's the difference between mind wandering and really creative daydreaming, which is absolutely incredibly important. So I'm kind of parsing different forms of reflection in our society, seeing what the obstacles are to doing them, looking at the latest cognitive science, and coming up with some really amazing revelations related to the practice and skill of thinking and what it means to, to just begin to, understand how to become more aware of your surroundings. I call it, in another chapter, I talk about the so-called fallow hour, which is my word for those pauses, those rests, what sleep does to memory. These are all incredibly important, ways in which we can become a more thinking society. And what is really, as I mentioned, the threshold to all of this is the willingness to withstand uncertainty. the narrowness, the shallowness, the cowardice of certainty of the quick conclusion is anathema to that kind of risk taking that reflection really is. Reflection. I'm trying to talk to people about restoring the process into thinking. It's not always comfortable, but there is a process to this type of thinking, and that's something that when we value what is quick and automatic and neat and instant in our lives, we're valuing what is the definition of a machine. That also speaks very directly to that side of us which does jump to conclusions and lacks skepticism. So there's a whole side of us which is forgotten when we have this symbiosis with the machine. And I think it's right there. Again, there's a renaissance of attention at hand, and there's also an ability to practice thought, which is far more doable and valuable than we might be understanding at the moment.
I wonder if you can make a little bit more concrete when you talk about the need to be comfortable with or embrace uncertainty. Could you give an example or two of that to help me understand what you mean by that and how it can be important or helpful to people in their lives?
Well, most reflection begins with a moment of uncertainty. For instance, when we are, as usual, following the routine of our lives and we're making unconscious decisions where we get coffee and where to park the car and what we're going to have for dinner even. I mean, these are just really automatic behaviors. We don't have to think very hard. When something jumps out at us or something takes a big turn, an argument in a relationship or a really difficult, a client leaves at work, a murky, muddy problem, that creates uncertainty in the human creature. And that's the moment when we can choose to either jump to conclusion and run with it or pause, in evolutionary terms, humans have certain instincts like fight or flight and also to freeze. That was, what the animal did to gather more information, and that's evolved into this capacity to reflect. So uncertainty is that moment when things do look uncertain. But it's also a moment when you can choose between multiple possibilities or just the first thing at hand. And so one of the most important parts of reflecting is understanding different options. Again, in the medical world, young doctors who are taught to reflect show far less signs of these kind of heuristic biases. They're able to see symptoms that are really hidden. For instance, in a case of someone who has a heart attack, but they don't have chest pains, it's very hard usually for doctors. If they're taught to reflect for just 10 minutes, their mind is able to, iteratively go through the possibilities, test and understand them. And all this is very, very hard to do, actually. But
sure,
it's a kind of a journey of uncertainty. This idea of not knowing can be, again, in a concrete way, putting your work aside when you're stuck or when you're go for a walk. That means you're allowing yourself not to know for that particular point in time, or in the vein of the tolerance that's so sorely needed in our country. Tolerance is really, to me, not just living and letting be. It's actually a very complicated kind of practice of reflection. But basically, the not knowing is we categorize people so instantaneously as us versus them. It's absolutely astonishing. It's so quick and it's so unconscious. And our behavior changes. If you're white and you see a black face, You remember that face less. You don't process the features in a just gestalt way. Process a face of your own kind in a very, very different and more granular way, which leads to better memory and individuality. Well, moving beyond that is really a matter of not knowing. I don't know that person. So one of the ways in which you can boost tolerance is just by thinking of others as individuals. Then people begin to get to know, so if you see someone walking down the street in a kind of hoodie and you're making assumptions about them on a dark night, you see them as an individual, and then you're saying, well, I don't know them. So this is the not knowing is extremely important to basically what I'm saying is to the open mind, opening our mind and then going forward. That's really what not knowing is about.
Yeah, now I can see how this takes us back to the beginning of the conversation. How can you begin to see someone as an individual, and if you're not taking the time or don't have the time, or if you're exposing yourself to constant other stimulus, right? There's no opportunity to reflect.
Exactly. You're abbreviating what processes in thinking that do take time. And that constant abbreviation has incredible repercussions on all of what we've been talking about, which is the ability to think and the ability to discern, the ability to basically build knowledge. I mean, the studies show that creativity has fallen from kindergarten to adults since the 1980s precipitously in the United States. And these are the best possible longitudinal measures. But the score that's fallen the most is something called elaboration. And that is, there's been a 40% drop over time in both children and adults. That's the ability to put flesh on an idea, to follow something through, to persist, to not, cut short what can be these astonishing capacities that we all have to think. And I think that it doesn't take much, but we have to get beyond the idea that, quick is successful, that signs of deliberation in CEOs and political leaders are actually, research shows that's correlated in people's minds with weakness and incompetence, even when they are deliberating about something they don't know anything about. So we have to change these values related to speed, related to multitasking, related to what kind of thinking and what productivity is. And people have told me, teachers, when I go talking around, the world and the United States, teachers in particular, others, even teachers, though, have told me if they were ever caught sitting and just thinking, it would look like they were doing nothing, and therefore they just don't dare sit and think. Wow.
Wow. Yeah, that is shocking. And you've given examples in which people might spend as little as a minute or a few minutes pausing. We're not necessarily, as you said, talking about hours or days on a retreat, although that might be something someone could do. Sometimes it might be as little as a few minutes, it sounds like. It could be enough to help with that kind of reflective thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's been shown in so many different situations. I know one doctor who also does research into mindfulness, and he pauses just a moment before he opens the door into the next room to see the next patient. And that's really changed the way he works. And that's a very, very, and it's allowing our mind to catch up with our body. We're racing. It's sort of trying to put ourselves back together again. And the other thing I think that is sort of Buddhist or interesting about this notion of pause, or I should say just culturally human, is that, there is throughout so many different societies, both East and West, the idea of suspended judgment. So the pause as the beginning point of the open mind means that you're suspending judgment. The ancient Greeks called this epoche, It's related to beginner's mind in Zen. There time after time, I've seen very many different societies that all have this value about suspending judgment, not leaping to a conclusion, basically, I guess you could say. But it's really hard, and it doesn't lead to indifference. It can at the extreme. You're not trying to stay on the sidelines of life. It's not an inactivity, although it seems to be in our current society. This is really, thinking in pursuit of a better answer. You're pausing in pursuit of thinking and thinking in pursuit of a better answer. It's not, inactive in activity, and it's not emptiness.
It's interesting when you talk about the need to pause before making a judgment. In my day job, I'm a lawyer. And so, of course, we use the term judgment in my field. And I remember when I started, there was a more senior lawyer who told me the story of a lawyer he knew who, through the 1950s, refused to have a telephone on his desk, would only communicate with clients in person at a scheduled meeting, no walk-ins, would talk to them and would never give advice at the meeting. He would require that the client go away, and he would then write a letter. I think he had some rule about how many days later it would need to be at a minimum. And he would only do it in writing. And that was his reasoning, that he, in order to give competent counsel to his clients, needed that time to pause and reflect. And these days, I know, whether it's true or not, the feeling amongst most lawyers is that none of us would ever get another client if we insisted on interacting with clients that way now.
Right. Well, but it's interesting, though, again, going back to that consulting work, people in the consulting business were absolutely petrified that clients would find out that they were taking one night off a week. And yet they did, basically it turned out that the clients were happy to have the better quality of work. I've also heard this in terms of flexible work hours in the accounting world. The accountants have been pioneers in terms of flexible work arrangements. Again, the clients were thrilled to have the better work, not the veneer. And so, I guess we all need to stitch together from our own threads of our lives and our voices, the fabric of a new kind of society. And I do really believe that can be done, because when things get dark, they're going to be a dawn. There's going to be a dawn, and renaissances do follow dark ages. And I think that's really important. I hear stories after stories about the people who perhaps speak less and think more as being the ones who do get ahead. Or react less, yes, I should say.
Yeah. Well, on that note of a hopeful future, I'd like to thank you for taking this time to talk to me about attention and distraction and reflective and creative thought and everything you see in the present and the future of it. We're all looking forward to seeing and reading your new book, Beyond Certainty, when it comes out later this year. So thanks, Maggie.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for this Technology for Mindfulness podcast with me, Robert Plotkin, and today's guest, Maggie Jackson, author of Distracted. If you liked today's episode, please leave us a review on iTunes and share the episode with your friends. Those and all other links are in the show notes. Please join us for our next episode, where I'll interview Dr. Judson Brewer, Director of Research at the University of Massachusetts Center for Mindfulness, addiction expert, and author of The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits. I'm Robert Plotkin, and I'll join you next time on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast.